A shaft of light slammed across his face and the brass stopwatch clicked. Fear rose in the subject before his eyes adjusted. He counted the echo of the click as if it were a threat. He forced his hands to unclench and pushed his palms flat against the concrete floor because fear made his fingers numb and steady action helped him keep track. The warden stood in the doorway with the stopwatch in one hand and the heavy keyring in the other. He did not step inside, look at the time, the warden note the pulse. The warden added after a beat. The subject swallowed and mapped the room by touch, noting the single seam in the wall where light entered, and the groove worn into the floor near the wall where men had sat to wait. The opening event is immediate, a forced wake meant to measure reaction. The subject has fear as his root emotion, and every small decision that follows is shaped by that fear, fear of unpredictability, fear of losing time, fear of appearing broken. He is not thinking of escape yet. He is thinking of counting. He counts breaths, taps his knuckles on the floor, marks seconds by the rhythm of the warden's fingers. He wants to survive and to write down what happens. That need to record is how he resists. The warden's voice is thin and clinical. Subject, if you can name the day, do so now. The subject answers, horse, Tuesday. The warden nods and clicks the stopwatch again. The night guard stands in the corridor with folded arms and a shadow between his boots. The medical observer watches a tablet, reading vitals and skin tone through grainy camera feed. The subject feels monitored. The warden measures silence with a barely perceptible nod and records posture changes in his notebook. Fear pushes the subject to small, precise acts. He moves his lips to breathe through the nose. He takes inventory of his joints. Those acts are how he keeps his mind from unmooring. Within minutes, the warden steps back and slides the cell hatch closed. The experiment is ritualized. Light will be given and withheld on a strict schedule, and every visible reaction will be logged. The warden explains the schedule to the night guard and the medical observer with clipped sentences: 5 minutes on, 30 off, 40, 5 on. Document any irregularity. The night guard repeats the sequence aloud and taps the corridor railing. Understood, the night guard says. The medical observer writes without looking up. The control alcove is small and cold. The warden points at a panel of switches, and a brass stopwatch lies on the table like an instrument of law. The archivist arrives with a small lamp and a stack of labeled folders, records. The warden asks, "All accounted?" The archivist replies. The warden lays out the experiment as a diagnosis, how perception of time hardens obedience. The subject, alone in the cell, hears this through the air vent as if the words were being poured into his ribs. Outside the cell, the warden's steps are precise. He taps the stopwatch in 3 beats and signals with a knuckle on the wall. The subject times those beats and matches them with his breathing. He writes invisible numbers on the inside of his mind. The first emotion shift happens when doubt turns to alarm. He doubts whether counting will help. Then he hears the faint hum of the corridor lights fail, and alarm sets his hands trembling. The subject says aloud, low, "Warden." The word is an attempt at communication, and at proof he is still coherent. The night guard performs a clinical check through the hatch after a long stretch of darkness. He opens the hatch enough to insert a small lamp and records the subject's pupil reaction without touching the skin. Eyes respond sluggish. The night guard says, "Pulse shallow." The medical observer replies from the screen. The subject forces his jaw down to stop teeth from chattering. In that moment he feels the second emotion shift. Alarm tightens into stubbornness. Stubbornness becomes method. When the archivist slips a folded notebook under the slot during a supply pass, the subject's fingers find it, and he feels a quick, fierce clarity. The notebook is small, pages bent from use, time, stamped entries scrawled in tight, cramped handwriting. The subject had hidden it weeks earlier and used it to log the light schedules and the changes in his appetite, the minutes of sleeplessness, the exact positions of the warden's shoulders when he signaled success. The archivist places the book on the console and taps it with a gloved finger. "A record," the archivist says. "This is not in our files. Why keep this?" The warden reads entries without surprise. The medical observer checks dates and nods to himself. A tiny rebellion emerges. The subject times a visible reaction on purpose to bait the night guard. He inhales so loudly that the breath can be heard through the hatch, and then he knocks twice on the wall with his knuckles, the rhythm practiced for days. The night guard pauses, then knocks back once, impatient. The subject keeps knocking. The night guard opens the hatch a fraction wider than protocol allows, and the subject sees the night guard's face for the first time, close, unshielded. "Why are you doing that?" The night guard asks. "Why are you making me open this?" The subject keeps tapping. "I'm testing." The subject says, "I'm marking time." The night guard's jaw tightens. "Don't try to mess with me," he snaps. The warden watches the exchange from the control panel and writes a note. The warden's tone does not change when he speaks. Protocol breached. Note reactive behavior. His voice turns the knock into data. Tension rises because the warden treats human responses as experimental variables. The subject's small gambit succeeds only in exposing the human element. The night guard's fingers hover over the hatch lever, and then he closes it, but the close is delayed. That delay is a fracture in the system. It is proof the system is not absolute. The subject feels a new shift. Stubbornness becomes something sharper, a quiet hope that noticing can unbalance the warden's plan. The warden orders an inversion of the schedule, full glare for 5 hours, he says, then total blackout for 72. The medical observer looks up at the warden. "Those durations will accelerate neural fatigue," the medical observer says. "Yes," the warden replies, "we must observe the limits of expectation." The corridor lights flare to a white that lifts the subject's lids against his will. The light is raw and the texture of the room becomes painfully visible. The subject covers his eyes with the back of his hand and counts backward, because counting forward has become contaminated by panic. He tests his pulse, fast, then flattening. He tastes metal. The glare is designed to erode orientation. Within the room, the subject's sense of time fractures into segments, so small they feel like edges. The second the light appears, the second it vanishes, the seconds between blinks. Speech becomes difficult. The warden watches the monitors and reads out numbers, pupil constriction increasing. Irregular breathing after 2 hours. The medical observer records oxygen saturation with a clinician's voice and a cursor that blinks. The subject hears the cursor blink like a second metronome. He breathes on command when the warden says, "Breathe now," and holds it when told to hold. The warden nods at each compliance. Words turn to commands. The subject says, "Stop," in a whisper that is an appeal and a test. The warden answers, "Protocol, warden." The subject says again, clearer, "Why?" The warden steps into a sliver of shadow and tilts his head. "To measure," the warden replies. "To refine." "I will not be data," the subject says. The warden's eyes do not change. "You already are," he says. At the center of the chapter is the inversion, the deliberate swing from light to total dark. This is the climax beat. The warden hits the blackout switch, and the corridor goes silent except for distant mechanical hums. The subject's hands slide on the floor and his palms scrape concrete as he sits up in the dark. The medical observer's voice goes low on the intercom, vitals degrading, pupils non-reactive. "Apply Protocol 3 if cognition declines by 20%. The subject tries to say the numbers aloud to anchor them, and his mouth produces thin sounds. When he reaches blindly for the wall, his fingers encounter the seam of the light source, and his knuckles bruise. The room feels smaller, because the mind makes it smaller. In the blackout, the subject's thoughts accelerate into a different rhythm. He begins to hear things that are actual: water dripping, the night guard's boot on concrete, the warden's breathing through the vent. He distinguishes them from imagined sounds by placing his hand on his neck and feeling his carotid pulse. That physical action keeps the fear from collapsing into panic. The subject counts his pulse and recites times from the notebook. Then he finds, by touch, the frayed cloth band at his wrist and touches the faint horizontal scar on his right wrist, concrete proof of previous confinement. He runs a thumb along that scar and it grounds him. After a long, sustained blackout, the medical observer reports altered cognition. The subject stumbles when the hatch opens for a check, and the night guard offers a cup of water without meeting his eyes. The archivist watches the warden read the subject's notebook and sees the warden pause on a single entry where the subject wrote, "I will name the time if I can keep it." The archivist leans in. "He is writing his hours," the archivist says. "He is resisting by recording." The warden closes the book and nods. "Catalog this as adaptive behavior," the warden says. The subject survives but is visibly hollowed. The medical observer measures diminished vitals and altered cognition and writes in a ledger, Subject retains basic orientation but shows disordered circadian markers. The medical observer says. The archivist files the behavioral data and stamps a paper. The warden puts down his pen and stands over the subject. You will learn to wait, the warden says quietly. The subject swallows and looks up. His voice is a dry whisper. I remember time. I remember how it moved when my mother left the gate unlocked. That memory is concrete. A morning with a slamming gate, not a vague fragment. It keeps him tied to a life before the cell. The warden and archivist review the night's records in the study at dawn. The warden folds his hands over the stopwatch and speaks about procedural refinements in tones devoid of empathy. Reduce interval variability by 7%. The warden says. The archivist types the change into a ledger. Increase observer checks during the first 12 hours of inversion, the archivist suggests. The warden approves with a nod. We will adjust cues for the night guards so that reactive breaks are minimized. They speak like surgeons discussing incision technique. The subject, carried into the annex by 2 guards, listens and writes small corrections in his notebook with a trembling hand. A twist appears. A late entry in the subject's smuggled notebook contains an observation the warden had not predicted. The subject had written the exact time when the night guard's knock is delayed. A signature pattern tied to the night guard's work shift. A detail that shows the night guard does not follow the warden's rhythm out of loyalty but out of impatience and need. The archivist reads this aloud. The night guard's hesitation matches his coffee break times, the archivist says. The warden studies the line and frowns. The warden had assumed perfect obedience. The subject's record reveals fissures. This revelation changes how the warden will refine the schedule and how the subject will leverage tiny patterns to survive. Another emotion shift occurs here. Clarity follows fear. The subject sees a path. If he can predict the night guard's impatience, he can stage small disruptions that force openings. Fear is still present, but it has shifted into a measured tactic. The subject practices knocking patterns in the annex while the medical observer reads vitals. He times the night guard steps and records them in fresh ink. There is a small confrontation between the warden and the night guard. You opened the hatch too far, the warden says. You know protocol. The night guard answers with a short, rapid series of lines. I know protocol. I also know when a man will break without water. You ignore that and you kill them slowly. I won't be part of that. The exchange lasts 6 back and forth lines and ends with the warden's hand dropping to his notebook. Note insubordination, the warden says. The night guard walks away. That argument changes the dynamic. The warden's control is not absolute because his staff are human. The chapter closes with the subject catalogued as a case study and the warden planning refinement. The subject signs his name on a sheet because an official signature is required. His hand shakes, but the act of signing is concrete and intentional. The archivist files the notebook and slides a stamped cover over the subject's records. The warden returns the brass stopwatch to its drawer. The final beat is a concrete action. The warden locks the drawer and the archivist turns the key. The subject, carried back to the cell for further observation, counts the click of the key with a steady hand and writes the time in his hidden notebook. The chapter resolves its immediate conflict. The experiment completed and its damages recorded, but the system remains in place and the subject has learned a modest tactic to unsettle it. The last paragraph ends on a situational beat rather than abstraction. As the warden closes the study door, the night guard stands in the corridor and mutters the single word, "He'll try again." The subject hears it through the vent and, with a pencil stubbed behind his ear, writes the exact minute the door clicked shut. Emotion roots and shifts. Fear starts the chapter and motivates the subject to count and record. Alarm turns to stubbornness, then clarity. Clarity becomes measured tactic. Emotions are shown through counted breaths, the placement of hands, delays in opening the hatch, the tap of a stopwatch, and the sound of the key turning. External events punctuate the narrative every few paragraphs. Hatch checks, the archivist's arrival, the night guard's knock, the warden's order to invert the schedule, the blackout, the medical observer's readings, and the final filing of records. Dialogue drives confrontations and reveals. Warden, night guard, archivist, medical observer, and subject exchange short, readable lines that expose control, defiance, and procedural cruelty. The chapter completes the mini conflict by showing the subject survived the inversion and by revealing that the warden's assumed control contains blind spots the subject can use. It ends with a concrete action, the warden locking the drawer and the subject recording the time. Lights snapped off in a precise sequence and the corridor fell into engineered darkness. Fear tightened the subject's throat and directed his hands. He counted the click of a distant switch and matched it to his breath. The cold fact of the blackout announced the chapter's problem. The facility would remove time, light, and certainty to make a person unreliable to themselves. He remembered the brass stopwatch from the shaft of light in the waiting chamber, and the click that had started the old counting. That memory pushed him to act. Fear moved him to steady, mechanical motions, to count, to listen, to test. He lived inside measurement now. The subject had learned to measure absence the way other people measured hours. He pressed his palm flat to the concrete and listened for the sound of shoe leather on the corridor beyond. He tried to map the darkness by the order of sounds. When another set of footsteps stopped and the warden's footsteps came closer, the subject tightened his jaw and bided the moment. The warden's voice arrived, close and controlled. Hold. Record the blackout. Observe reactions. His words were not loud, they required attention. The assistant guard moved a lamp and clipped its flame. An observer in the gallery clicked a note into a metal book. The subject counted the sequence. That counting was the line he drew against erasure. The known was the only tool he had. The facility's entrance to this experiment was simple. Remove external cues and watch for internal collapse. The first external event arrived when an assistant guard pushed open the processing alcove door and led the subject out. The subject's steps were short. He kept the hidden rhythm in his head and did not look at the warden. He had a small notebook folded into his sleeve. He had not forgotten the barter he had made with time itself in the waiting chamber. The brass stopwatch and its click haunted him. In the alcove the warden examined him with a slow inspection. He did not touch at first. He watched hands, chest, the way breath left a body. You have something, the warden. The subject's fingers tightened on cloth. He did not answer. The warden's gloved hand lifted and felt the sleeve seam. The assistant guard leaned forward, and the observer moved closer with a slate. The subject smelled leather, old paper, and candle smoke. The warden tapped a 3-beat rhythm against his palm and then drew out the notebook. The confiscation was deliberate and clinical. The warden opened the subject's hidden notebook, slid it free, and closed it into his own small leather journal. I will file this, he said. The subject's hands, which had been counting breaths, went slack for a heartbeat. He tried to reach and his fingers only brushed fabric. A new fear arrived. The loss of private record. He had used the notebook as a proof of sequence, a ledger of time, and now possession of that ledger moved into the facility's archive. He could no longer trust the tally in his head as the only evidence. The warden walked to the control room with the journal under his arm and a measured gait. In the glass he left behind, the subject saw his own pale face pinned between two shadow bands. The control room smelled of brass and old gears. The warden set the journal on a table and began to adjust mechanisms. He moved levers that controlled lamps and looms, and he spun the faces of clocks. The observer recorded each change in a tight hand. The warden's modifications were visible and exact. He altered the cycles by minutes, by the odd pattern of seconds, and then reset the display so that the cells would receive conflicting signals. The subject was returned to his cell under a schedule that no longer matched anything he had counted. The first mismatch came when the light that had once marked the hour came instead at an angle he had not trained for. He flinched when a lamp clicked on 5 breaths too early. He recalculated in the dark, his cadence faltered. His breaths became short and irregular. A new emotional shift moved him from fear into a tremor of doubt. Suspicion that his personal rhythm could be stolen turned into the concrete problem of how to prove it. The observer's note that night was terse. Altered cycles recorded. Subject destabilized. The subject heard the word through the wall as a reverberation of metal. He tried to anchor himself by humming a pattern he and the other inmate had created, but his mouth could not find the sequence under the new offsets. He pressed his forehead to rough concrete and counted the sound of his pulse, but the numbers did not line up with the light. The room had become instrument and judge. An unexpected collapse happened 2 nights into the altered schedule. During a claimed hour that had been made to stretch and then compress without pattern, the subject's vision skittered. He staggered against the cell wall. He felt a sudden clang in his chest and then a blackout at the edges of sight. The assistant guard opened the door and found him kneeling, palms flat on the floor.
The observer shouted, "He fainted!"
The warden paused and removed his gloves. The warden's response was not immediate kindness. He catalogued the collapse. Time of convulsion, breathing pattern, pupil response. He ordered a pause, not out of concern, but to check variables. The subject woke in a narrow infirmary alcove with a rag over his mouth and the taste of metal under his tongue. He attempted to speak and the warden's notebook lay open on a table, the page marked with a small, precise symbol. The warden, he is proof and anomaly, that sentence held no human inflection. The subject's fear turned into anger at the exposure of his body to the experiment. Yet while the warden measured, the subject found another human detail. In the wall between cells, a faint tapping returned, the cadence he had taught the other inmate. 3 knocks, wait 2 knocks. The pattern ran. The other inmate's name was not used in official files, but he had a voice and a hand and a stubborn method. The subject answered with the last 2 counts and the wall returned vibration. For a moment the subject felt a shift from isolation into connection. The exchange was small and concrete. A rhythm transmitted through concrete. That contact changed his plan. The warden discovered the cadence by accident. He noticed altered breathing notes on the monitor and checked the logs. He called the assistant guard into the corridor and said, "They are teaching each other time. Remove the contact." The assistant guard nodded and moved to the adjacent cell block. The subject heard the footfall of the guard approach the other inmate's door and felt the corridor's metal taste in his mouth. He counted and tried to hold the rhythm in his throat. When the assistant guard reached the adjacent cell, he tapped the wall with the heavy end of his baton. "Stop that noise," he said. The other inmate answered only with a single low sound. The assistant guard offered a short, clipped sentence. "Name." The other inmate did not say his name. The guard left with a report that read, "Non-compliant vocalization suppressed." That suppression became evidence for the warden's escalation. The warden convened at dawn. He stood over the control console and described the new plan without raising his voice. Extended nothing. Isolate subject on shifted schedule. Remove any expectation of release. The observer annotated his words. The assistant guard tightened the locks. The subject heard the phrase and felt the room narrow again. The new order turned schedules into punishment. The internal emotional shift rode the external change. Suspicion hardened into a quiet, resolute defiance. Isolation began as a change of lights and end of day sounds. The subject's meals arrived at irregular intervals. When food came, the tray was cold. When the lamp burned, it did not match the time his body had set. He counted and miscounted. He mouthed the cadence to himself and then tore a scrap of cloth to bind it in the seam of his clothing. He had one surviving act. To keep a mark of time that no one could fully erase, the facility's tactics grew narrower. The warden extended periods with no sensory input. He removed music, he muffled the sluice of water, he ordered the assistant guard not to speak except to read times. The subject found that his days compressed into a few mechanical acts: breathe, listen, press his palm to the wall, hum the code. Twice he misjudged the light and rose to stand before it, only to find nothing. Each misstep cost him sleep and the texture of certainty. He began to measure his life in micro-holdings. The interval between breaths, the pause between a knock and a reply. A mid-chapter twist came when the observer, flanked by the assistant guard, slipped a folded paper under the warden's door. The subject overheard the warden say, "You altered the clocks beyond my parameter." The observer's protest was low. It destabilized him prematurely. The warden answered with an edge. "Then note the failure and we refine." The folded paper held a line of ink. The subject later read in the margins of a discarded log, "Warden A." Calibrated these changes after similar collapse in his record. The subject's understanding shifted. The warden had not only designed the experiment, he had applied it to himself in the past. The horror changed shape. It was not abstract doctrine, but a practice the warden had learned through his own damage. When the subject reconstructed that margin note later, His emotional movement moved from defiance back toward a cold, strategic caution. If the warden bore the method on his own body, then the warden's decisions had been forged by private pain. The subject now had a concrete lever. The warden's attachment to measurable outcomes. He began to plan not to escape the building, but to preserve a specific ledger entry that would prove the method's cruelty. The warden's escalation became explicit the morning he ordered absolute sensory subtraction and placed the subject on a raised schedule. He brought the stopwatch from his coat, its brass face dull under candlelight. He tapped it and said, "We expand the interval. We remove the hinge of expectation." The subject's mouth went dry. He could not read the numbers from where he stood. He watched the warden hold the stopwatch like a small planet. The tempo of the world compressed down to that tiny instrument. The confrontation began in a narrow corridor outside the isolation block. The warden held a candle. The assistant guard stood one pace behind him. The subject was led forward with his hands behind his back. The corridor smelled of wax and iron. The warden lifted the heavy keyring and let the metal drop once into his palm. It sang a low final chord. Choice. The single word landed like an order. The warden set two options in plain terms: submit and keep your small comforts. Refuse and we remove any private trace you own. The ledger will be emptied and your name scrubbed. The subject's counting stuttered. He had already lost the main notebook. He had only fragments hidden in seams of clothing. If he surrendered, he kept what he had. If he refused, he risked a deliberate erasure. The warden did not raise his voice. He measured the subject by breath. A rapid exchange followed. "Warden," said the subject in a whisper, voice raw, "you cannot erase what I speak now." The warden's reply was a single measured sentence. "Words are easy. Records are harder." The assistant guard, "Do it now, warden." The warden tapped 3 times on the stopwatch and then spoke a quiet command. "Remove his seams, search him. Take what is left." The subject heard the assistant guard's boots shift and felt the blade of a glove slide at his waist, where a seam had once held paper. He lunged, not out of strength, but because flight is sometimes the only honest response. 3 rapid lines of dialogue followed as the subject pushed. "Stop," shouted the assistant guard. "Hold him," said the warden. "Do not damage the fabric," ordered the observer in an urgent whisper. The subject twisted and felt the seam pull. A scrap of paper slid free and fell. It fluttered like a small bird of language. The warden's glove plucked it up and read a single line. His face did not show it, but his fingers tightened. The line matched the rhythm the other inmate knew. The warden looked up and said nothing. The moment became a pivot. The warden's hand lingered on the scrap, and he mouthed a word he had not said before. "Proof." The assistant guard looked uncomfortable. The observer shifted notes. The subject saw a crack in the warden's posture that he had not seen when the man was clinical. The warden's controlling certainty wavered for a breath. That breath was the cliffhanger of the chapter. Would the warden punish and erase, or would he absorb the proof into his files and claim calibration? The answer changed how the chapter closed. The warden chose the record. He ordered the assistant guard to seal the scrap into a locked envelope and write, "Test data." He gave the subject a clinical look and said, "We will keep the record, and you will be useful." The subject understood the barb beneath the sentence. Usefulness here meant further study, not mercy. He swallowed his rage and nodded once. He let the assistants lead him back to isolation. The other inmate tapped twice against the wall as if to say, "Hold on." The subject pressed his palm to concrete and felt the residual ring of key metal against his skin. In the cell, the subject worked quickly. He undid a seam and tucked the last fragment of testimony into a hidden fold in his tunic. He rewrote a minute sequence on the inside of a strap. He threaded words into the hem where the warden's hands would not find them easily. He had learned the language of concealment from nights of hunger and the precise hands of the other inmate. This act was not rhetorical. It was a defensive cataloging. He would not let the facility claim all speech. The warden logged the confrontation as a success. He marked variables as stabilized. He set new thresholds on the clocks. He filed the scrap under Case 12. Variable accepted. The observer wrote notes and then left. The assistant guard returned to routine. The warden closed his journal and walked down the corridor with his head slightly bowed, as if weighing the cost of each entry. By dawn, the isolation had produced a quiet endurance in the subject. He had lost the larger notebook, but he kept the hidden seam. He had preserved a line that proved the method's mechanism. The warden meant to record victory. The subject meant to leave proof. Each held a different ledger. The scene closed with a small, loud fact. The warden filed the session as a success, while the subject slid the last small folded note back into the seam of his clothing and pressed his palm once to the concrete wall. He breathed out. The final paragraph of the chapter tied itself to a concrete beat. The warden snapped his journal closed. The assistant guard locked the corridor, and the subject whispered the cadence into his sleeve and heard, faint through the concrete, the other inmate's reply. The exchange was small, but it persisted. The warden had recorded outcomes. The subject had preserved testimony. Either record might be used. The corridor held the echo of a measured tap, and the chapter ended with the subject threading his remaining proof into cloth and feeling the metal cold of the keyring pass into a pocket on the warden's belt as someone moved by. That single movement, metal against fabric, was the last concrete event that closed the chapter. Fear, emotion shifts. Suspicion, fear, doubt, defiance, anger, cautious strategy, renewed defiance, resigned calculation.